Welcome everyone to our next webinar here with No One Stands Alone. And today's topic is we're going to be talking about anxiety and depression. And I've titled it What's Wrong with Me? Because oftentimes when we are struggling with anxiety and depression, we don't recognize it for what it is. And a lot of times we can actually be wondering what is happening to us, like what's going on, because we don't recognize all the signs and all of the symptoms. And a lot of times we misread what we're actually experiencing. And I'll use an example from my own personal life. For many years, like now, having been this far away from those times in my life, I recognize that I struggled with severe anxiety and depression. But in the moment, I would have heart palpitations. I would have like this uneasiness in my gut. And so I would often think, do I have some kind of stomach ulcer? Am I having a heart attack? I would go to the hospital and often ask, tell the doctors about what I was feeling. They would do like all sorts of echocardiograms on my heart and all of these different tests. And every time they came back normal. And so a lot of times when we're experiencing these things in our life, we can be we know that something's wrong. We know that our life is in turmoil. We know that we're under extreme amounts of stress, but we don't always understand what is going on. And so sometimes we can be thinking, what is wrong with me? And so I really wanted to address this fact and really dive a little bit deeper into, well, what is anxiety? What is depression? What are the signs of them in our life? How can we determine, what exactly it is that we're dealing with? And then once we know what we're dealing with, then what are some strategies that we can use to come out of those things and actually cope with them or actually, get onto the other side of those things. And so that's what we're going to be sharing about today. So oftentimes we don't recognize what we're feeling. It is actually anxiety and depression. And I know for myself that it was the case. I know for quite a few people that I actually have been working with, that is also the case. And I wouldn't be surprised if that is the same situation for you, that, what you're going through right now, some of the things that and I'm sure that as we continue on this conversation and you see what some of the symptoms are of these different issues, you'll be able to recognize, you'll be able to identify with, maybe I am struggling with anxiety. Maybe I am struggling with a little bit of depression. And also times we can wonder, like, what is going on, because where did it come from? You might be going through life, everything seems fine, nothing's wrong, like nothing serious is happening in your life, but all of a sudden it's almost like a switch turns on, and you have this ocean of problems or these emotions or these things that are happening, and you don't really know where it's coming from. You don't really know why, because when you look at the circumstances of your life, in a lot of cases, you're like, I live a pretty good life. I have a job, I have a family, nobody's died in my family. There's like a lot of good things going for me. So why in this particular moment am I really, really struggling? And so sometimes we can overlook it because of that. We'll just say, like, I don't have any reason to be struggling right now. And so we might just dismiss it or like I said, misdiagnose it as some kind of other physical ailment, when actually what we're experiencing is just anxiety or depression. Psalm 139:23 says, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." And I know that I'm pretty sure we all understand the fact that anxiety is derived and comes from our thoughts. And this is a good reminder to us that when we're in those times of anxiousness or those times where we're not really sure what's going on, this is a really good time for us to slow down and to ask God to search our heart. Ask God to really, take a deeper look at what we're thinking, what we're feeling, and ask God for his wisdom and his direction in what we're struggling with and why, because obviously he knows us better than we know ourselves, and he'll be able to answer those questions for us. So the first thing I wanted to deal with today is, well, what is depression? So the clinical definition is it's a medical condition characterized by feelings of severe despondency and dejection. It's typically also with feelings of inadequacy and guilt, and often accompanied by a lack of energy or disrupted appetite and sleep. And so, I mean, this, I think, is pretty typical of what we would expect for depression. You know, when I think of someone who's depressed, you know, they have a difficulty getting out of bed. They have a lack of motivation. They have, you know, a lack of sense of purpose, or they really don't have a sense of drive to do anything. And a lot of times it's accompanied by a lot of negative emotions and feelings. And some of the physical symptoms or symptoms that you will have when experiencing depression is excessive worrying. And that's not surprising, because worrying is a form of anxiety and is often the precursor to depression. And so if you are feeling depression, I would almost 100% of the time say that you're excessively worrying. Another one is feeling restless or on edge. You know, never feeling settled, not being able to really calm yourself down, and always feeling like something's wrong or something's coming, or you have to be prepared, like almost always being in that fight or flight response. Another one would be muscle tension. And, you know, this one for me personally is a huge red flag for me, because, you know, yes, I do a lot of physical work in my life, but there's times where, like, clearly I know that I am under a lot of stress simply because I am so tense. Like my shoulders, my neck, all of it becomes like this wall of knots. And it's at those moments where I'm like, well, like I know that I'm just under a lot of stress right now and I'm not handling it well. Another thing you might be experiencing is feeling of worthlessness. This often is accompanied because, you know, you have a lack of sense of purpose and a lack of sense of, you know, drive, or, you know, maybe you're in a situation where you can't work. Maybe you're too ill to work, or maybe, you know, there's just, you know, what you used to do doesn't work anymore, or maybe you lost your job. For whatever reason, you might have a lack of sense of purpose. And that would, you know, exasperate your feelings of worthlessness. If you didn't have a purpose in this life, you would feel worthless. You could also feel excessive guilt. And another huge one for me is withdrawing from friends and family. I find that when I'm entering into periods of depression, it's at those times where I often withdraw from people. I don't want to be around people. The thought of talking to people causes me more anxiety and stress. And I just want to completely withdraw and be alone. Another one that could be present is reckless behaviors. This isn't one that I personally have a lot of, but some people will revert to like addictions or extreme behaviors just to, you know, get that sense of, you know, aliveness, or try to get themselves out of that funk. You know, I've heard of people doing stuff like skydiving and weird, like extreme things that they would never do under normal circumstances, but, you know, in their depressed state, they might do something extreme like that just to try to get themselves out of feeling those ways. Another normal one for me as well is fatigue. Fatigue is huge. In fact, and it also affects your sleep patterns, because if you're not sleeping well, then you're even more tired. But it's not just fatigue on in regards to sleeping, but it's like fatigue in every area of your life. Mental fatigue, emotional fatigue, physical fatigue. And it's like you just have absolutely nothing left. There's also changes in appetite. And oftentimes when I am in times of a depressed state, like I literally don't feel like eating. I have absolutely no appetite. And in some cases, even the thought of eating makes me feel ill, anger and irritability. That's another huge one for me as well. Like am if I'm finding that my ability to cope with what's happening around me is depleted to the point where I'm like getting irritated very quickly and having outbursts of anger, that's usually an indicator that, I'm not handling my stress very well, and it's bringing me to a point where I need to address these things. I need to look at it a bit more. For some people, they also feel physical pain. And I think this could be attributed to, the stress, the tension. It could be because you feel physical symptoms such as like stuff in your gut, or like for me, the heart palpitations. So people actually feel physical pain because of the depression. Persistent sadness. I think this one is probably the biggest indicator, especially in my life. If I can't get myself out of those thought patterns or out of those negativities, and I just find myself constantly in a place of prolonged sadness, that's often an indicator that I'm not in a good place and I'm struggling with depression. There's also trouble concentrating and suicidal ideation, which isn't usually something that happens right at the beginning of a time of depression, but it's something that would come, as you've journeyed through this for quite some time. And I mean, it can come earlier in the process, but for a lot of people, it's because they've been in this depressed state for a long period of time, and they've actually lost hope. They have no hope that this is ever going to end. And so that's when a lot of the suicidal thoughts will come. So what's the difference between depression and anxiety? Well, the definition of anxiety is it's a mental condition characterized by excessive apprehension, worry, or nervousness about a real or perceived threat. Now, I would say that anxiety will also always be a precursor to depression, because it's the obsession and the worry about these thoughts that actually create the depression in us. And especially that was my experience, and it has been the experience of many people that I speak to and work with. They don't just wake up one morning and be depressed. It's a gradual thing that happens over time, and it happens as a result of not being able to manage their thoughts and the feelings and the emotions associated with their worries and their fears. And so I'm going to go over some of the symptoms of anxiety, and some of them might seem a little bit similar to depression, but we will see some differences here. So symptoms of anxiety, there'll be nervousness, restlessness, and being tense. So some of those are the same, but they're like, so that I would say it's on a lower level. Like, for example, when I feel depressed, it's impacting me in greater ways than anxiety would. And when I feel anxious, it's like, not to say that it's minor, but it's just not as consuming as when I feel depression. You'll also feel feelings of danger, panic, dread. You'll be worried about things that are going to happen in the future. And a lot of the times, most of the time, they're just things that you think will happen. And 90% of the time, they never actually happen. And so you're consumed with worry and panic over these things, but the chances of them actually taking place in your life are very rare. You also experience rapid heart rate, heavy sweating, weakness and lethargy, difficulty focusing. Excuse me. Insomnia, digestion issues, You'll also have a strong desire to avoid things that trigger your anxiety. And so that means, if you had something that you desire, like just love to do, but all of a sudden it caused anxiety in you, then you're going to actually start avoiding those things, even though you previously loved to do them. You might also experience trembling and muscle twitching. And so I'm sure you can see from these definitions and these symptoms of anxiety and depression, in a lot of cases, it's going to be easy to, mistake the two. Like, how do you know if you have anxiety versus depression? And I would say that if you're just starting to experience these things, then I would say you're experiencing anxiety. And if this has been prolonged over time and you're consistently having these issues, then it's going to develop into something more serious like depression. So when we don't deal with our anxiety, it actually creates within us what we call panic attacks. And these panic attacks are something, it's a feeling of sudden and intense anxiety that makes you feel that you need to run away or get away from that situation as quickly as possible. It actually triggers in your body the fight or flight response. And a lot of times when we are experiencing these panic attacks, we try to fight them, right? We try to, we don't want to be in these panic states. We're always trying to get away from it. We're trying to stop it. But the good news is that you can actually stop panic attacks really quickly. The bad news is you're not going to stop them by resisting it or fighting it, because that's actually going to make it worse. That's actually going to make them last longer and be more intense. And so I'm going to go over a few ways that you can handle panic attacks and that will actually help them resolve extremely quickly. So what do we do with panic attacks? First of all, you need to accept them, because I just want to mention right now that we all deal with anxiety. We all have moments where we don't know what to do. We don't know how to handle the situations that we are in. And it's normal for our bodies to go through this panic response. And so if we come to the point where we can accept it for what it is, and we can just even say to ourselves, oh, this is just a panic attack. It's okay. This isn't going to last forever, and it's gonna go away, and I'm gonna be just fine. So if you can accept it and not run from it or resist it, it will resolve itself very quickly. The second thing you can do is try to figure out what's actually bothering you, because oftentimes the thing that we think triggered it actually isn't the issue. And you might, and often I would encourage you to do this after the fact. Like, for example, you're not going to try to figure out what's happening when you're in your panic attack. Okay, that's not going to help you calm down. What's happening to me? What's happening to me? No, that's something that you would do after the fact, so that you can create tools and strategies so that you won't have the panic attacks as much or as frequently in the future. Another thing you can do is give yourself permission to feel anxious. For example, let's say you just started a new job. You've never done this job before, and your boss is asking you to do something that you feel unequipped to do. Well, it would be a moment that you would feel legitimate anxiety, right? So first of all, give yourself permission. It's okay for me to feel anxious in this moment, right? Because as soon as you do that, it actually loses its power. Then what can you do with that? Well, okay, it's okay that I'm feeling anxious right now. I'm not really skilled to do this. So then what will I do with that? I'm going to maybe ask my boss for a little bit more direction and say, you know what, I haven't done this before. Can you just give me some pointers so that I can, do it well and do what you're asking me to do? So instead of allowing that anxiety to build up, be like, oh no, I can't do this. I'm going to fail. I'm going to be fired. All of these things. We actually take, I'm going to say take authority over that thing, but But what we're actually doing is we're, number one, acknowledging it, validating it, but then we're actually finding a solution instead of giving it power to consume us and control us. Another thing you can do is use positive dialogue. So this is a little bit similar to giving yourself permission to feel anxious, but this takes it one step further. So using positive dialogue would be along the lines of, if I was having a panic attack, Laura, it's okay that you're having a panic attack. It's going to pass. You're doing just fine. And then be like, you know what? And if I had recognized the root of my panic attack, maybe I had just seen a friend who the last time I had been around them, it was very volatile and very hurtful to me. So then I can say, you know what? I'm actually a really good friend. And the reason why this impacts me so much is because I do care, right? So I'm speaking positively about myself, about the situation. I'm framing it in a new way to help me not enter that anxious state, but instead recognize it for what it is, give it permission to be there, let it pass, and then speak positively to myself. Another thing you can do is distract yourself. So a lot of times, if we're in the panic, we want to solve it right now. We want to stop it. And oftentimes, if we just distract ourselves with something else, then we'll find out, 30, 60 seconds later, maybe even 90 seconds later, that whole panic response in our body has resolved itself. And we've kind of moved through it without having to do anything about it. And the last thing is laugh at yourself. And in some situations, you might have difficulty seeing the humor of it. But in the moment, trying to stay relaxed, stay calm. One other thing I didn't write on here, which is breathe. And that's probably one of the most important things, because oftentimes when people have panic attacks, they actually start hyperventilating. They get so anxious, they get so wound up, they get so emotional that they actually start breathing very rapidly. And so how you can relax and stay calm is actually by regulating your breathing. Take long, deep breaths and allow your body to actually calm down. And at the end of the day, you just need to let time pass and let your panic attack pass. And I personally have not had too many panic attacks in my life, but I do know people who have. And as we've chatted about this and we've discussed this, these steps do actually work. And the more you can accept the fact that what you're experiencing is just a natural response to what you're going through, and give yourself permission to feel it, and you just breathe yourself through it, you'll find that those panic attacks should be over within a minute or two, and then you can move on. 1 Peter 5:7. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. And this is a great tool that you can use because, like I said earlier, we all have stress. We all go through moments where we don't know what to do. We have anxieties about the future. We've had things come up and we have fears, and we don't know what to do, but we have someone in our life that does know what to do, and we can cast all of our cares on him, and he cares so much for us, and he wants to carry our burdens for us. And like the scripture in Matthew says, his burden is easy and light, and all we have to do is exchange ours for his, and he will journey with us, and he will help us process the events of our life in a way that is not harmful, is not heavy, and that he can help us move to the other side. So I created this thing to help us visually see what happens in our life. So, we might have a circumstance, some kind of stressor, a trigger, maybe even some loss in our life. And it automatically is going to start a physiological reaction or stress and panic response in our body. Okay. This is something that naturally happens every time that we have something like this. And that's oftentimes why, you feel, you have that knot in your stomach, you feel panicked, you start sweating, you have all of these physical responses. And those physiological reactions, that stress and panic response, that fight and flight response, we have something called ants. It's automatic negative thoughts that rise up. And so, as you can see in this chart, when we have that physical response, it brings in our life negative thoughts. We try to ignore them, we resist them, or sometimes just plain give up. And when we get to that place where we have those negative thoughts, those anxious thoughts, those things that keep coming through our mind, causing us to feel these things over and over again, it's actually what creates the anxiety and depression in our life. And it creates this awful cycle, right? Because, we live in a world that we're going to have circumstances, we're going to have stresses, we're going to have things that trigger us. And we're going to continually go through this cycle of this physiological reaction. The negative thoughts come up. We don't know how to deal with them, causes anxiety and depression. We just keep going around this cycle. So I just want to share with us a few statistics. The average person has over 6,000 thoughts per day. And 80% of those are contributed to negative thoughts. Now, I want you to just take a moment and think about those two statistics. If I were to take that seriously, and I believe it to be true, because when I think about even my thought life and mine, like, I work pretty hard at it, I would say probably at least 50% of my thoughts, my automatic thoughts that come, are negative. And I'm working, like, I work at this a lot. I try to practically, think of my thoughts and catch them before they become spiraling out of control. And I can honestly say to you that I probably have about 50% of negative thoughts out of those 6,000 thoughts I'm having every day. And out of all of those thoughts, statistics say that 90% of our thoughts are repetitive. So not only are we having these negative thoughts, but they're being repeated. And not just multiple times every day, but daily. And so what these thoughts are called are ants, automatic negative thoughts. And so if we're having this many negative thoughts every day, they're repeating themselves, they're constantly being thought of and repeated in our life, this actually causes us to experience heightened levels of stress and anxiety. So I'm sure seeing this, you can see how it's so easy to be overcome by anxiety and stress if we don't really take initiative in this and make a change. And so, this might seem quite depressing or quite like out of control. Like, well, how can we ever conquer this? Like, if this is just naturally how we're wired, how we are in this world, this is what is naturally happening. How do we come out of that? Well, I want to share something cool that will help us change that statistic. So, some facts. Everyone experiences stress, fear, pain, anxiety, and panic. These things are normal, and they happen in our lives every day. So I think the first thing to understand and to come to terms with is the fact that these emotions that you're feeling, they're normal, okay? You're not abnormal for having these thoughts. But it's what we do with them that's going to determine how we process these events in our life. So this is a really interesting fact that I want to bring up to us today. First of all, God designed our bodies to go through our complete fight and flight cycle in only 90 seconds. So what that means is God created within us this mechanism that no matter what we face, whether it's stress, fear, pain, anxiety, we're going to have this natural fight and flight response that happens in our body. This only takes 90 seconds for these chemicals to be released, go through our entire body, and come back to our brain and tell our brain whether or not this situation that we're going through is something worth, like, for example, if you were being faced by a bear, you would have this fight and flight response. All of these chemicals would be flushed through your body, it would get to your brain, and your brain would conclude, this is dangerous situation and I need to do something about it now. Okay? But at the same time, let's say, you were in a traffic jam and all of a sudden somebody cut you off. You're going to have that same 90-second cycle. And after 90 seconds, your brain has the opportunity to say, okay, that was a close call. Nobody got hurt. I can move on with that. Okay? So, but what happens when we don't stop that flight or fight response after 90 seconds? Because it's after those 90 seconds that we have the opportunity to either continue that cycle and use strategies to calm ourselves down and rationalize what's happening, or we can actually continue that cycle in our body. And I'm going to show you how. So some ways that we can actually stop that cycle is, number one, acknowledging what you're feeling. Number two, validate how you're feeling. Consider how you can make changes to your circumstance. So, for example, if something negative is happening, you can figure out if there's something that you can change so that you no longer have to be experiencing that negative situation anymore. Another huge one is to listen to your body, because our body, this chemical response in our body tells us a lot. And so, for example, one area for me is when I'm starting to feel super stressed and super overwhelmed, and I'm starting to feel that fatigue. When I listen to my body, that tells me that I actually need to rest. It tells me that I actually need to stop what I'm doing and maybe go take a nap, or maybe go for a walk, or maybe go grab a tea and just take a 20-minute breather and just let everything else go and just take a break. And then also realize that you have the power to change the outcome of what you're experiencing. And then, like I said earlier, examine, well, what is really bothering you? What is the source of your stress and anxiety? And is there something that you can do about it? And then also, if the situation that's happening is something that's been directed to you, something that's been said to you, something that's really hurt you deeply, ask yourself this question: was it true? If there was no truth to it, there was no validity to it, then just let it go. And if there was, then you can take steps to make changes in your life so that those things are no longer true, or that, you can change that situation. So, like I said, this process that God's created within our bodies takes only 90 seconds. So we can change our life in just 90 seconds. And this is a quote from a psychologist. And he says, when a person has had a reaction to something in their environment, there is a 90-second chemical process that happens. Any remaining emotional response is just the person choosing to stay in that emotional loop. So this is the really, really important part I want to make, important point that I want to make. The 90-second emotional or chemical process that happens, which is the flight and flight response in our body, is natural response to our stress, our anxiety, our trauma. Okay, that is normal what happens. So I would say to you, expect that to happen, because that was something that God's hardwired into our bodies. Okay, but after those 90 seconds, we get to make a choice. We can either choose to stay in that emotional response, or we can choose to get out of that. And I'm going to use an example. Have you ever had, something happen to you, and then all of a sudden it's like it triggers this sequence of negative thoughts? I'm not a good person, I'll never amount to anything, all of these things. But then you find yourself, not more than a couple minutes later, you're having exactly the same thoughts over and over again. And it's almost like this tape that keeps replaying itself in your mind. Well, this is that 90-second chemical loop replaying itself. So what if after that first 90 seconds, you chose to stop that loop? You chose to get off of that loop. And so that's the skill, that's the strategy I want to teach you how to do today. So here's our same chart. We have the same circumstance, the same stressor, same trigger and loss. It's going to trigger the same physiological response of stress and panic in our body. However, if we, at that point, recognize it for what it is, and we're able to not go into that negative thought pattern, and we can actually stop it and replace it with positive thoughts or acceptance of what's going on in our life, instead of it driving us to anxiety and depression, it's actually going to create hope, perseverance, and resilience in our life. It's going to create an opportunity for us to create skills and strategies so that when the next circumstance, stressor, and trigger happens in our life, and we go through the same physiological reaction, that we can start to have new patterns of thought and continue to choose positive thoughts. And it becomes a different kind of cycle. So instead of that negative cycle that leads to anxiety and depression, we can actually create new cycles of thought, new cycles of patterns in our life that is going to actually cultivate hope, perseverance, and resilience. So I know I've shared a few of these already, but what is the solution? Ask yourself, is what you're thinking true? And for example, I'm going to use a personal example from my life. I went through a very, very traumatic event, and my husband, I expected him to be present. I expected him to be supportive during that point of time, but he didn't understand my loss. He didn't understand what was happening to me. And so for him, it was a non-event. But to me, like, it impacted me to the deepest part of who I was. I lost something so valuable to me. And because of his lack of care, because of his lack of, consolation or encouragement or support during that time, because to him, it was a non-issue. So he just went on with his life. But here I was struggling so much. And so the thoughts that I had were, my husband doesn't love me. He's so selfish. He doesn't care about anyone but himself. And I kept having these thoughts, and they kept going over and over and over in my mind. And I would actually rehearse conversations that we would have, if we were to talk about this issue, and what I would say and how I would say it, and how I would tell him that, he's this bad guy and he doesn't care about anyone, and how he didn't take care of my needs. And I just went over this and over this and over this. Got to the point where not only was I angry, but now I was getting bitter towards him. And these thoughts kept turning and turning and becoming bigger and becoming more. And my thoughts about him were getting worse and worse and worse, to the point where now I was resentful, and to the point where I started becoming hateful, like having hatred towards him over this, because he didn't care about my situation. And it got to the point where I hated who I was becoming. And I didn't realize that this whole situation, if I had stopped it at the beginning and really evaluated the facts, my husband had no idea what I was going through, because it was a miscarriage that I had. First of all, we didn't know we were pregnant. So how would he know anything about that? Second of all, he's not a woman. He's never had a child. So how would he understand the loss that I was going through? And also, it was so early on that, he didn't understand the emotional attachment that I had towards this child that I lost. And so when I look at it through those lenses, of course, he would have no idea what I was going through. But instead of getting off of this negative mindset and rabbit trail, I'll call it, instead of getting off of that and actually examining the truth in the matter, which was that my husband had no idea what I was going through. And it was actually my job to communicate to him how I was struggling. But instead of reaching out to him, instead of telling him I was struggling, I actually withdrew from him, and I actually became more bitter and angry and resentful and hateful towards him. The next thing is, does having this thought serve me? It got to the point where I realized the thoughts that I was having towards my husband were not serving me. They were causing me more harm than good. And I had to get to the point where I didn't want to be the person I was becoming. I wanted to have my joy back. I wanted to have my life back. I wanted to feel loved and connected in my marriage. But I didn't have any of those things. Another thing that you can do is look, is there another explanation or another way of looking at your situation? Because a lot of times when we go into our negative thoughts or the negative things that come through our mind, they're not even based on reality. They're based on our own emotions. They're based on previous situations or how we think other people have treated us in the past. And so another way to get off of this rabbit trail or this hamster wheel of these thoughts is to ask yourself, is there another way of looking at this? Another thing that you can do is, imagine that this was your friend going through this situation. What advice would you give your friend who is having that same thought, who is going through that same situation? And if you think about that, that will help you reframe what you're going through, reframe what you're thinking, these thoughts that are bombarding you, and change them into something more useful, something that will actually help you change that cycle from being a negative cycle leading to anxiety and depression to something that would be more hopeful and give you purpose in your life. Another thing you can do is ask yourself what the Bible says about your situation. The Bible has, in my opinion, the answer to everything that we'll face. And in the darkest times that I've had, when I've sought the Lord and I actually looked in the Bible, He's brought me great comfort. He's given me the words that I needed in the right moment to help stop me in these negative cycles. And so I think consulting the Lord, praying about these things, going to the Bible is such a huge strategy in getting off of this cycle of negativity and of anxiety and worry. And we need to utilize that more often. That should become our our go-to, the first thing that we do. And the last thing is change your negative thoughts into pets. They're called positive, empowering thoughts. So instead of the ants, you want pets. You want the positive thoughts. And so a great way of handling this is, if you are really, really struggling with a lot of negative thoughts about your situation, about what's going on in your life, I would encourage you to write them all down. Because often in the moment, after the fact, you're not going to remember them, or maybe you will, but they won't be as, what's the word I'm trying to say? If you don't write them down right away, you're going to forget that those are the prevailing thoughts that you're having. So when the same situation happens again, they'll come back. But what you want to do is write them down as they come up, so that you can actually create new thoughts, so that you can come up with the positive thoughts or truth to replace those negative things in your life. So I'll use an example from my life. This week, I've actually endeavored to pursue a new adventure. It's one that challenges me. It's one that causes me to think outside the box, one that is motivating me to grow in some skills that I don't really have right now. And I've had a lot of a lot of things not go right. And so this week I actually had quite a bit of struggle with my own negative thoughts about, I'm not going to succeed at this. I'm not good enough. I'm a failure. People are disappointed in me. And I had all these thoughts, and they kept revolving around in my mind. And it wasn't until a good friend of mine asked me one question, and her question was, what were some, good takeaways from this week? And I couldn't answer her question. I had no idea about, like, I had no sense of anything good that had come from that week because my mind was so focused on everything that I didn't achieve, everything that I messed up, everything that I failed on, and I couldn't see the positive in it. But her question to me was so huge because it alerted me to the fact that this is what I was going through, but then gave me the opportunity to stop this process, stop this cycle, and say, okay, yes, I didn't meet all my goals, but I'm actually, these are some of the positive, empowering thoughts that I've replaced them with. I actually can do this. I actually, I can actually develop new skills. I am perseverant, so I will persevere and I will succeed, and so instead of looking at what I didn't achieve, what I couldn't do, I started looking at what I could. The fact that I don't give up, that I am perseverant, that no matter how many times I fail, I get back up. Those are the things that I am now focusing on. The fact that I put my whole energy and everything that I have into what I do. And so being able to change those thoughts, now I have a positive outlook on this new adventure that I'm on. That not only am I going to be able to do it, but I'm going to succeed. And so next time that maybe I have a setback or I have a disappointment, I'll be able to rely on those positive thoughts and say, no, I can do this. I've got a team of people helping me. I know what I need to do. I just need to follow through and be consistent. So creating these positive, empowering thoughts are huge. And so when we can write down all of these negative thoughts that we're continuously having, maybe about ourselves, maybe about somebody else in our life, maybe about our situation, maybe even about God himself. What are the thoughts that are we having that are causing this continual response in our body that is creating this cycle that's causing this anxiety and depression in our life? And how can we stop that and switch it into become something positive in our life? This is an acronym I told to my kids when I was homeschooling them, because oftentimes, I just found that, the atmosphere in our home wasn't always what I wanted it to be. It wasn't uplifting, it wasn't encouraging. And I think this applies to what we're talking about today. And I would say, guys, I want you to think before you speak. And I'm challenging us to think before we think. Think before we speak, right? Before we speak to ourselves, that internal talk that we do. Let's think before we speak to ourselves, okay? So the acronym T is for true. Is what I'm thinking true? Okay, because if it's not, then we should probably ditch it right away. Number 2, is our thought helpful? Is this thought going to help me move forward and achieve what I want to in my life? Because if it's not, then we should ditch it. Is this thought inspiring? Is it going to encourage me? And is it going to spur me on to achieve what it is that I want to do? Because if it's not, then it's not serving us. We need to let it go. Is the thought that we're having necessary? How many thoughts do we have in a given day that are completely unnecessary? I have a lot of them. I'm working on it. I'm sure you do too. But is it necessary? Is me thinking about this and me meditating on this and me, letting this thought revolve in my mind necessary? Most of the time, probably not. And number 3, and the last one is K, kind. Is the thought that I'm having towards myself or towards other a kind thought? Because if it's not, then it's not what God wants us to be thinking. So often I would encourage you to remember this acronym, think. Is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? Or is it kind? And if it doesn't If it's none of these things, then I would say it's probably not a thought that you need to continue thinking. It's probably one that you want to get off that rabbit trail and you want to replace it with something different. Philippians 4:6-8. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and mind in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Now, here's one particular scripture, and I know there's dozens more, where God, encourages us to guard our mind, to protect our thoughts, because it's our thoughts that drive our actions. It's our thoughts that create our futures. So if we're focusing and we're thinking negatively, if we're allowing ourselves to go through this cycle of constant turmoil and thinking the worst and having anxiety and worry about our future, then we're not opening ourselves up to the hope that and the freedom that Christ freely gave us. We aren't allowing ourselves to live in the peace of God. He says his peace will transcend our understanding. So we might be going through the most horrendous situations in our life, but God promises us that we can live in peace, and that regardless of what's happening, that we can live with this not only a peace in our life that comes from God, but also knowledge that he's never going to leave us. He's never going to forsake us, and that whatever we're facing, he's going to be there right with us. And so this is similar to the THINK acronym. If it's not good, then don't think it. And so if the thoughts that you're thinking aren't good, then I challenge you to stop thinking them, because they're not serving you. And I actually just met with a lady earlier this week, and she was let go from her job. The way they treated her was absolutely awful. And I sat there for half an hour listening to her story. And after she was done sharing, I said, you are 100% justified in your anger towards these people. And she said, yes, somebody agrees with me. Yes, somebody understands me. And I said, however, these emotions of anger and resentment and all of these things that you're feeling, I said, they're not serving you. Okay, you're justified. You have not been treated well, but they're not serving you. And I said, you're going to need to make a choice. You can either continue on this cycle of being mad, angry, wanting to get retribution, all of these things. But I said, the only person it's harming is you. I said, you get to make a choice. You can either choose to forgive them, accept the fact that this happened and it was bad and it was wrong and it should have never happened in the first place. But forgive them, release yourself from that, and then you can move on. Because I said, as long as you stay stuck in these thoughts of, anger towards these people and how unfair it was and the injustice and all of these things, you're not going to be free. You're going to be stuck in this. It's going to be that hamster wheel constantly going every time. And this happened at her school. So every time she steps in that school, that hamster wheel is going to keep going. And afterwards, she said, thank you so much for sharing that with me, because it shifted her. And that's what I want to share with you guys today. What in your thinking, what in how you're processing the things that are happening in your life, even though some of them might be awful, some of your feelings towards those things might be justified, but is it serving you? Because if it's not, I challenge you to stop and to choose a different way. You don't have to constantly be thinking all those things. And you know what they are because you're the one who's been thinking them. You're the one that's been experiencing these things. And I know for myself, because I have to constantly be catching myself and seeing the areas where I get caught up in this cycle too. We all do. But the cool thing is that once we learn something and we know something, then we have the ability to change it. And so I hope one of my hopes for you today is having learned this, not only about how God created our bodies and our physiology and how it affects our mind and how our thoughts affect our emotional well-being and our anxiety and depression, but we have the control and we have the ability to change the outcome. So even though maybe right now you are struggling with anxiety and depression, you don't have to stay there. You have a choice. And you can make that choice today. And so I encourage you to do that. So we're going to do an activation here. And I want us to apply this 90-second rule. I want you to think about the most troubling thoughts and feelings that you've been having recently. Okay? I want you to first of all recognize what kind of impact they've been having on your mental health as well as your physical health. Okay? I want you to write down these negative impacts. And then I also want you to write down the feelings or the thoughts that you've been having associated with these issues, okay? And then I want you to try to think of how you can shift these thoughts and feelings into something that are actually going to benefit you and actually help you get from that negative thought pattern into a positive thought pattern that's going to encourage hope, resilience, and purpose in your life. So as we finish off today, I want to highlight a few points to remember. First of all, depression and anxiety is normal response to stress and issues in our lives. And we can control how we allow it to affect us. So I hope that point you really got tonight. So first of all, just recognizing that these thoughts and emotions, they're normal. So there's nothing wrong with you. So if you've been thinking like, what's wrong with me? You can just say, you know what, this is normal. We all experience these thoughts, these emotions. They all come to us in different ways, in different intensities, but we all experience them. And the other cool thing is that you can have control of how it impacts you and what you do with it. The second thing is don't run away or resist your feelings of panic. These are normal responses to extreme moments of stress, whether it be something that you really should be afraid of or something that is just being triggered within you. It is a natural response to in our bodies that happen. And so just allow them to take their natural course. If you don't resist it, it won't take long and you can just let it pass and then you can kind of think it through afterwards. Number 3, your thoughts will either be positive or negative, and you can dictate whether you remain stuck in your problem or if you're able to move through it. So I encourage you that when you recognize those negative thoughts revolving, that you realize what it is and you can stop it and start to shift your thoughts and shift your perspective into a new way. And the fourth one is 90 seconds is all it will take for you to change how these stresses impact you. So my question to you is, what are you going to do with your next 90 seconds? The next time you find yourself on that wheel, what are you going to do? So I encourage you to stop and change it. Hop off of that wheel. And this saying, if you don't change nothing, then nothing will change. So if you've found that you've been in a repetitive pattern of being in these anxious states or these states of, uncertainty or just however it manifests in your life, if you recognize that you have repeated patterns of these things, then if you want those things to change, then you're going to have to change something. And I encourage you to use the strategies that we taught today in our webinar. Proverbs 12:25, I'm going to close with this scripture. Anxiety weighs down the heart, but a kind word cheers it up. And a lot of times when we think of the scripture, we think of sharing kind words to others, but I'm calling us to a higher level and that we would say these kind words to ourselves. Because how many times are our words directed towards ourselves as negative, as depleting, as we don't have any value, we're worthless? Like, you know what you say to yourself. But let's start speaking words of kindness, of positivity, of God's purpose and his destiny over ourselves, because that's what he speaks all throughout the Bible. And if you don't know what those things are, then spend some time in the word and find out what they are and start speaking them over yourself, because that's what's going to lighten your load. That's what's going to take that load off you. And that's part of the activity that we did today, just shifting my thinking, like literally lifted a weight off my chest. And so we have the power and the ability to do that in our lives. So next month, we're going to be talking about coping mechanisms and, what are they? And I'm going to be talking about 4 of the most common ones. And, are they helping us or hurting us? And because we all go through situations in life, we all go through stresses, and we all cope in some way or another. And so I want to address that and talk about some of the most common ways we deal with these issues and whether they're beneficial or not. And so I invite you to come back May 4th on Zoom. And since I think all of you are pre-registered, you'll automatically get the invite in your email box. And if you don't receive it, just give me a text, a call, or a message, and I'll share it with you again. And before we end, I just wanted to let you know that we are still doing our 100 Pledge Project fundraiser for the year. This is one of our main fundraisers that we do yearly. It's going to the end of April. If you wanted to contribute financially to this, you still have opportunity to do so. So far, we have gotten 8 pledges for a total of $445 raised. Our goal is to have all of these green spots chosen as donations. So, we're looking for donations of any size. I mean, what remains is $2 to $98. So if you want to support what we're doing and you have any means, whether it's, $5 or $15, whatever you have that you would like to donate helps a lot and goes a long way to supporting all the initiatives that we do with NOSA Foundation. So and also, I would encourage you to share this with your friends, family, or other people that you know that would like to support good causes like what we do. And also remind you that if you like listening to podcasts and you like listening to Connie and I, and you drive a lot, then feel free to subscribe to our podcasts, because we talk a lot more about these topics there, and we do it in like conversation style, and it's a lot of fun. So if you want to hear more from us, feel free to check us out on our podcast.